Young men, you may have noticed, are a bit out of sorts these days. Disaffected, disconnected, uncertain of their place in the world, and increasingly, it seems, rather pissed off about this state of affairs. We are seeing them turn, in this anger, to extreme political ideologies and actions. We are seeing them flock in greater and greater numbers toward various gurus and tribal elder figures and other self-appointed guardians of a masculinity now felt to be under dire existential threat. Perhaps most worryingly of all, we've seen this frustration drive a small but growing number of men to horrific acts of theatrical violence. All over the world, men appear to be in growing desperation to make their presence tangible, and in this desperation they are resorting to ever more radical measures. What the hell is going on here? Explanations abound, but most to date cut only shallowly or obliquely. Many present as little more than opportunistic smears against some hated outgroup or ideological boogeyman. Even disregarding their often transparent bias, these are at best only partial explanations, pitched at the level of nebulous socio-political forces whose causal connections to the individuals who actually enact these grievances are unclear and often only vaguely gestured at. If we're to really face up to this issue and address it effectively, we're going to need to look past our ideological blinders and narrow tribal allegiances. We're going to need to really dig into the science of human cognition and behavior. In my observation, qua lay anthropologist of the so-called manosphere, the emotion that sits at the core of this crisis of masculinity is not rage or hatred per se, but shame. Men today are awash in either shame or the constant fear of it. This wouldn't, of course, be the first time in history shame has pushed large numbers of us toward radically reactionary personal and political behavior, but these past episodes have tended to have very clear triggers. In Weimar Germany, for example, the national shame of military defeat in the Great War was compounded first by the imposition of a treaty many found insulting and unfairly punitive, and then by drastic declines in living standards and purchasing power due to the hyperinflation resulting from attempts to meet said treaty's demands. Now, nothing nearly so conspicuous can be pointed to explain the current, decidedly more global, epidemic of shame. So what is its source? To answer this, we'll need to get a clearer picture of the workings of the various psychological components of what I'm going to simply call our shame system, and understand the original social context in which this system evolved. Shame is a very unique human emotion with, I believe, a very particular evolutionary history. It is different from both guilt and the fear-based subordination seen in other social animals. We feel guilt, for example, when we've caused harm to particular individuals, and the emotion spurs us to approach those individuals and attempt to repair the damaged relationship. We feel shame, by contrast, when we publicly violate some norm or fail to live up to perceived social expectations. And shame often motivates us not to reconcile with others, but to withdraw from them, or, in some cases, to retaliate. Now, this withdrawal behavior looks an awful lot like the submissive behavior that, say, a subordinate chimpanzee might display toward a more dominant individual. But shame is distinct from this affective mode as well. For one thing, submissive behavior is usually targeted to particular individuals, while shame is often diffuse. For another, submissive behavior is most intense when it's directed at the most dominant individuals in the group, whereas shame is felt most acutely among individuals of similar social status. Most of us don't lose a lot of sleep over being poorer than Bill Gates or Elon Musk, but we may experience quite intense shame and envy for failing to keep up with our neighbors. Finally, submission and shame have distinct triggers. The former is a response to the threat of physical assault, while shame, I will argue, is a response to the threat of social exclusion. Our capacity for shame reflects the emergence of an evolutionarily novel form of social organization. Whereas most social animals sort themselves into de facto hierarchies based on relative dominance, humans have adopted a second, and in many respects more important form of social organization based on prestige. Now, a lot of people who've stepped up in recent years to comment on these social dimensions of masculinity have tended to conflate these systems, but they are importantly distinct. Prestige differs from dominance in that it is eagerly bestowed by others instead of grudgingly surrendered. Its currency is admiration rather than fear. Acquiring prestige is a matter not of intimidating fellow group members, but of making oneself appealing to them. According to psychologist and shame specialist Paul Gilbert, shame is the particular emotion we feel when we fail to make ourselves appealing to others. That is to say, shame is the emotion we feel in the acute absence of prestige. Now, a few important developments facilitated this transition from dominance to prestige. First, individuals began to cultivate allies who could come to their aid whenever others attempted to dominate them. This is a quite old pre-adaptation. Strategic alliance formation is commonplace, for example, among male chimpanzees and female bonobos. Second, the advent of stone weapons, and later bows and arrows, would have had a considerable equalizing effect on physical formidability. Further discouraging would be dominators. It's risky to try bossing others around when anyone can snipe you from a safe distance or split your skull while you sleep. But the most important development, I think, was a radical shift in dispersal pattern, occurring fairly shortly after our ancestors split with those of our nearest primate cousins. Chimps and bonobos are what ethologists call male philopatric, meaning that the males spend their lives within the groups into which they are born, while females tend to immigrate to other groups upon reaching sexual maturity. Males of these species are in fact highly territorial with respect to outsider males, and it's not uncommon, among chimpanzees at least, for males who stray into the territory of another group to be mobbed and killed by patrols of resident males. Because male philopatry is also seen in our nearest taxonomic outgroup, the gorillas, it's highly likely that this was the pattern typical of the earliest hominins as well. However, when we look at contemporary hunter-gatherers, we find both women and men in equal percentages leaving their natal groups to join neighboring communities. This is a near universal feature among these peoples, and it was thus likely the norm among our more recent ancestors as well. But this change could not have happened without a radical reduction of default hostility between unfamiliar males. What might have led to this? Anthropologist Bernard Chappe addresses precisely this question in his 2008 book, Primeval Kinship. In it, he argues that the key to the dramatic increase in male cross-group toleration was the evolution of pair bonding and male parental investment. Over the course of hominin evolution, our brains more than tripled in size from around 400 cubic centimeters to around 1,400. A bigger brain, of course, requires a bigger head to house it, but the mechanics of walking upright placed rather tight restrictions on female hip width. Because of this, hominin babies had to be born earlier and cared for longer and more intensively. Their growing brains needed protein, and this, ancestrally at any rate, meant animal meat, and this meant hunting. The raising of infants thus became a two-person job, but reliably getting males to invest this much required a good deal of certainty that the infants they were provisioning and protecting were truly their own. Chimpanzees and bonobos of both sexes mate promiscuously, and adult males have little interaction with young. Hominin infants demanded far more cooperation than this, and it was in virtue of this necessity that monogamy and fatherhood entered our species' story. Now, what's significant about this development, according to Chappe, is that it would have allowed daughters to form lasting bonds with fathers and other male kin, bonds that would persist even after immigration to a new group. These females would thus have sources of male support in both their post-migration groups and their natal groups. See, a female's prospective partners and her male kin, fathers, uncles, brothers, and so on, have a genetic stake in her and her offspring, but, crucially, this stake is not zero-sum, for her male kin are not sexual competitors for her. This mutual and non-rivalrous investment thus incentivized greater toleration between these males, and in aggregate, between the different groups to which they belonged. In Chappe's words, these young females served as appeasing bridges between their former and current communities, and the greater the number of females relocating between these groups, the more reasons the males of each group had to tolerate each other. Eventually, intergroup tensions eased enough to permit males to start transferring between groups as well. But males, I suspect, would have still faced a kind and degree of scrutiny that most females probably avoided. See, an immigrant female would have made a large default contribution to any group she joined simply in virtue of her reproductive potential. An immigrant male, on the other hand, even a dutiful father, is a much less limiting reproductive resource. He would have been seen by resident males as a sexual competitor vis-a-vis any females in the group to whom he's not related. He also, of course, would have been a potential source of disease and disruptive violence. To earn his keep among his new fellows, then, he would have needed to demonstrate an ability and willingness to contribute to the group in valuable ways. He might, for example, be expected to cooperate with other males in hunts, to share game meat, or to help defend group members from predators and hostile neighbors. These are, in fact, precisely the expectations contemporary hunter-gatherer men place upon each other. It is out of these selection pressures that prestige, and with it our modern capacities for pride, shame, embarrassment, admiration, envy, and contempt, emerged. We offer prestige to those individuals with useful skills and virtues because we benefit from such people and want to keep them around. And we seek prestige because it grants us security in a community, makes us attractive to potential mates, and can often be parlayed into soft forms of social influence. In principle, this is a highly meritocratic system, in which one attains status in a group directly in proportion to how much one benefits its members. It's really hard to overstate just how profound an effect this transition to prestige has had upon our psychologies. Our ancestors' survival and access to reproductive opportunities absolutely depended upon membership in a group of cooperative foragers, and membership in such a group, or at least the principal benefits thereof, absolutely depended, particularly for men, upon this vital combination of competence and prosociality. These ancestral expectations resound even in our modern, decidedly non-hunter-gatherer societies. Psychologists Joseph Vandello and Jennifer Bosson, for example, have discovered a surprising asymmetry in how people tend to conceptualize what it means to be a man or a woman, an asymmetry more fundamental than any divergence in the particular contents of these gender roles. As they put it in their 2013 review paper, Hard Won and Easily Lost, a review and synthesis of theory and research on precarious manhood, quote, "Compared with womanhood, which is typically viewed as resulting from a natural, permanent, and biological developmental transition, manhood must be earned and maintained through publicly verifiable actions. Because of this, men experience more anxiety over their gender status than women do, particularly when gender status is uncertain or challenged. This view of manhood, moreover, transcends cultural boundaries. Regardless of culture-specific markers of masculinity, cultures around the world view manhood as a social status that must be earned and can be lost. In comparison, womanhood is typically viewed as a status that follows naturally from biological changes and that, once earned, remains secure." Unquote. This distinction makes ample sense in an ancestral hunter-gatherer context. Among hunter-gatherers, meat from successful hunts is mandatorily shared among all group members, a way of diluting the risks associated with individual foraging. This means, however, that everyone in the group imposes a default cost upon the others. Women may have been more able to offset this cost with a reproductive contribution, but men had to do so with continual, conspicuous, valuable action of the sort discussed previously. It was only through such action that ancestral men could attain and maintain their places within the groups they depended on for survival and reproductive access. This is the structural core of masculinity. The particular actions valued may vary over time and culture and circumstance, but there persists this central conception of manhood as a state of doing rather than being, a state that is consequently tenuous and fragile and revocable. Interestingly, Vandello and Bosson found that this conception was most robust among men themselves, a fact that shouldn't surprise us considering men were the ancestral community gatekeepers. The contemporary crisis of masculinity is also often called a crisis of meaning, and I think there's a good amount of legitimacy to that designation. Meaning, at root, is about connection to something beyond oneself, and for men, at least ancestrally, these kinds of connections were social connections contingent upon valued action. It's no coincidence, I think, that the nihilist complaint is often phrased as some variation on the following: nothing we do matters in the end. It is a lament that our actions, and by extension ourselves, will all ultimately lose whatever value they might be given. On the flip side, consider the appeal of religion, widely claimed to be a uniquely stable source of meaning. In the West, the predominant religion has been and remains Christianity, and the core promise of most strains of Christianity is something like participation in a grand cosmic plan, the ultimate reward for which is an unbetrayable, even eternal, social bond. Meaning is fundamentally a matter of earned belonging, a state critical to the survival of our ancestors. Now, let's consider in more detail the particular role of shame in this ancestral social context. Suppose you're a nomadic forager who's been slacking off in your hunting effort. Because you receive a share of everyone else's kill, you are imposing a net cost upon others in the group. Eventually, someone starts to tease or criticize you about your lack of hunting success. Perhaps others join in. Now, the shame this is apt to provoke in you has a variety of functions. 1. It signals to others that you're aware of your failings and that they are a source of discomfort to you. 2. It makes you less assertive with respect to your own individual interests within the group, thereby reducing your net cost. 3. It may motivate you to either up your hunting effort or find a new way of contributing to the group. Perhaps you just don't have the knack for hunting, but you're an ace hut builder. You might offer to take over this job for others. 4. It may motivate you, if feasible, to seek membership in a different group, either one with a lower average hunting capability or one in which your strengths outside of hunting would be better valued. That, at any rate, is one range of possible responses. It is characterized by what Paul Gilbert calls internalized shame. According to Gilbert, we can also respond to signals of social disvalue with humiliation, that is, with indignation and a desire for revenge against those who've judged us negatively. The particular response path we're likely to take upon receiving a signal of disvalue depends primarily on whether or not we find the negative judgment accurate and fair. Now, and this is crucial, overt criticism is not the only signal of social disvalue to which we're attuned. We also respond with shame or humiliation to being ignored or marginalized, and to seeing others receive praise or rewards that we don't receive. Let's return to our hypothetical hunter-gatherer group. Suppose your neighbor is, in your estimation, roughly equal in prestige to yourself. Despite this, you notice that he's received a bigger share than you of the latest kill. Now, you need to figure out what's going on here. Is your level of prestige lower than you thought it was? Has your neighbor made some sudden valuable contribution of which you're unaware? Has he merely struck some shady deal with the hunters of this particular kill? The first step toward answering this question will be to look at the shares of others in the group. If no one else received a bigger share, and you can't discern any reason why your neighbor might deserve a bigger share, then you're likely to believe some sort of unfairness was afoot, and will be motivated toward a humiliation response. If, on the other hand, you see that everyone else received a share comparable to your neighbor's, then you're more likely to internalize these signals, reevaluate your social status, and seek to improve your standing in decidedly more humble ways. That we estimate our status by comparing ourselves to others is a fact long known to psychologists and economists. What is less well known is that these comparisons don't all count equally. Specifically, our self-perceptions of status tend to be much more heavily influenced by upward comparisons, that is, comparisons with people better off than us, than by downward comparisons. This was first observed by the economist James Dusenberry in his 1949 book, Income, Saving, and the Theory of Consumer Behavior, and it has been noted parenthetically in a number of more recent studies. This phenomenon has not, as far as I know, been named, so I will call it simply the Upward Comparison Dominance Effect, or UCDE. It may seem irrational in today's world, but it made sense in the ancestral context to focus disproportionately on upward social comparisons. Hunter-gatherers, after all, are vehemently egalitarian, with very low ceilings on wealth and political influence. Prestige, consequently, is for them something close to a binary affair. You're either good enough to continue receiving group benefits, or you're not. So if you saw others being treated better than you, this likely meant you were under real threat of social exclusion, with all the existential peril that implied. Finally, comparisons made within our immediate social circles tend to affect our self-perceptions of status much more than comparisons within the larger groups into which we're nested, even when this broader social information would provide a much more accurate picture. This phenomenon is called, depending on which psychologist you ask, either contextual neglect or the local dominance effect. It's been studied particularly closely in relation to academic self-esteem. Suppose Alan and Carl go to the same high school. Alan gets straight A's and is accepted to an elite university, while Carl muddles through with just C's and ends up in a middling community college. Because of the different standards at these institutions, however, Carl finds himself suddenly at the top of his class, while Alan now struggles to make decent grades. What researchers have discovered is that people in Carl's position tend to feel much better about their academic performance than people in Alan's position, even though Alan is objectively the better student, and even when both Alan and Carl know this. The more local status information, in other words, dominates the bigger picture. It is preferable, it seems, to be a big fish in a little pond than a little fish in a big pond. Out of these three elements, our sensitivity to unfairness, the upward comparison dominance effect, and the local dominance effect, I think we can distill a rather uncontroversial principle of human psychology. We tend to feel best about ourselves when the most local groups to which we belong have the minimum number of upward comparison targets. For lack of a snappier name, let's just call this the envy minimization principle. We are motivated by shame or the threat of shame to realize the set of social conditions that best satisfy this principle, and we generally cleave to one of two broad strategies in our efforts to do so. Either we strive for greater prestige within our current local group, or we attempt to join or create a new group with fewer upward comparison targets. Which strategy we opt for will likely come down to whichever promises the easiest and most expedient path out of shame under our given circumstances. With this principle in mind, we are now, finally, equipped to understand the modern crisis of masculinity at the necessary level of depth and detail. My big picture contention here is that radical changes in how we construct our social environments are causing our shame systems to dramatically misfire, leading us to feel as though we're under near constant threat of marginalization and social exclusion. Let's unpack that. Our social environments have dramatically increased in size and complexity since our nomadic foraging days of old. We've gone from living in small egalitarian bands of 20 to 50 people to living in nation-states of millions, organized in staggeringly steep hierarchies of wealth and power. If all that weren't enough, an increasingly large share of our social lives now plays out in this vast, globe-spanning virtual world that provides us with unprecedented opportunities for group affiliation and public image curation. It is this latter, more recent development I want to focus on here. Of the many novelties the internet and social media platforms like Facebook, Instagram, and, yes, YouTube have introduced into our social lives, there are three that I think merit particularly close examination. 1. They have made switching and founding groups trivially easy. As mentioned earlier, there are two general strategies we can follow in attempting to increase or protect our social status. We can either intensify our competitive efforts within our current group, or we can seek out a new group more appreciative of what we can bring to the table. Again, the choice of strategy will be largely a matter of expedience. Now, what the internet has done is make group switching much, much more expedient than it's been in the past. In hunter-gatherer days, switching groups meant physically relocating and trying to ingratiate yourself into a very small number of alternative communities, a process involving considerable effort and risk. Now, the barriers to group switching are practically non-existent. A new social circle is only ever just a few clicks away. Consequently, this strategy of prestige seeking is likely to become more and more common, and I can't help but wonder here whether this phenomenon is what's ultimately responsible for the widespread perception that millennials, compared to preceding generations, lack grit and resilience, understood here as a willingness to stick it out and improve themselves within their current jobs, trades, schools, etc. I think it's not actually that millennials are less willing to compete for status. It's that the kind of competition they're now primarily engaged in is a competition between rather than within social groups. For the abandonment of one group is today usually accompanied by an explicit repudiation of the value system by which status was accorded within that group. We promote the hierarchies in which we feel we fare best and attack or downplay the ones that would place us in inferior positions. Much of the conspicuous contrarianism and, for lack of a more neutral word, snowflakey behavior we see among young people today, I suspect, really comes down to the increasingly widespread pursuit of this group-switching competitive strategy. 2. They have radically increased the average number of upward comparison targets per group for the majority of people. Now, at first blush, the removal of barriers to group switching might seem like a net good. Sure, it means we have to put up with more contrarians, but we might suppose that the greater ease with which people can now sort themselves into the groups most likely to value them would tend to make everyone happier and more secure in the long run. Unfortunately, this doesn't seem to be happening. See, the status benefits of this greater social mobility are now accessible, at least in principle, to anyone with an internet connection. These new groups draw membership from pools of talented devotees that may contain millions of people spread all over the world, the result being that the competition for prestige is likely to get stiffer everywhere. Whatever group you choose to affiliate with now, you're likely to be confronted with a large and ever-growing number of people whose skills and achievements utterly overshadow your own. The predictable result? Rampant social anxiety, shame, paradoxical loneliness, and a growing desperation to leave one's mark and garner recognition. Worse still, social media has given people unprecedented ability to manage their public images, and this has inflated the number of perceived upward comparison targets even further. We're now comparing ourselves, warts and all, to everyone else's highlight reels. It's like an endless high school reunion. In the past few years, a veritable cottage industry of research has sprung up on so-called Facebook envy and Facebook depression. Most of the earliest of these studies were merely correlational, and as such couldn't tell us whether social media use made people anxious and depressed, or whether more anxious and depressed people were simply more likely to spend time on social media. But newer research is much more strongly indicative of a causal relationship between social media use, particularly passive social media use, the kind most people are engaged in most of the time, and a variety of negative mental health outcomes. In a recent series of studies, for example, Wherein and colleagues found that exposure to upward comparison information on Facebook led to significant reductions in state self-esteem. 3. They have made prestige quantifiable and thus made upward comparisons much less ambiguous. Thanks to social media, we now have discrete, highly visible units of prestige in the form of likes, retweets, shares, clicks, views, subscribers, and so forth. In the past, we may have been buffered from a certain amount of status anxiety and shame by the ambiguities and inconsistencies inherent in verbal and gestural methods of status conferral. But there really isn't much left of this buffer online. Within these local domains, we can now know exactly how much prestige we have relative to others, and so can anyone else our privacy settings permit. The aforementioned research by Vogel and company actually looked at the effect of upward comparisons vis-a-vis both qualitative profile information, i.e. job and school info, selfies and travel pics, etc., and community feedback on content, i.e. the number of likes, comments, and shares one's posts receive. They found, perhaps unsurprisingly, that upward comparisons had the biggest negative impact on self-esteem when they were made along this latter quantitative dimension. Now let's see if we can't make these effects more vivid with a little story. Imagine, you're an awkward, introverted kid. It's clear you'll never be a star athlete or the life of the party, but you've got a thing, some niche interest to which you're passionately and uniquely devoted. Maybe you're an artist, a musician, an avid chess or video game player. Your family members, neighbors, and schoolmates have little appreciation for your talent, but you stick with it, despite their attempts to pressure you into more mainstream status games. It's something you've got that they don't. At some point, through the internet, you're finally able to connect to large numbers of others who share your passion for the thing. At first, this is exhilarating. Finally, you can be among those who understand. You feel immense validation. You thumb your nose at the haters and skeptics who'd made your pre-internet years so hellish. But this euphoria doesn't last, for it's soon apparent to you that there are a great many people in your new community who are much better at the thing than you are, much better perhaps than it seems you could ever be. And these people are getting all the attention and praise from the rest of the thing aficionados. How do you suppose this makes you feel? The thing was your ace in the hole growing up, your best hope for making your unique mark upon the world, your Hail Mary for meaning and purpose. How will you find value now? You may try to cultivate a new thing, but you're still likely to find yourself stuck between groups in which you have low status because the thing isn't widely valued, and groups in which you have low status because they attract the very best practitioners of the thing. You get the picture. Now, what are the cognitive and behavioral consequences of this omnipresent glut of upward comparison information, of this growing threat of valuelessness? Here are 7 that I trust will be familiar to most of you. I suspect you can think of others. 1. Contrarianism. I've touched already on young people's reduced resilience to within-group competition. Often, especially when feelings of humiliation are involved, this manifests as a contrarian attitude toward one's current group. Contrarianism is usually less an attempt to sway the entire in-group toward one's view than an attempt to birth or join a new group or subgroup in which one expects to have comparatively higher status. The contrarian abandons direct prestige competition for an approach aimed at undermining the very basis on which prestige in his focal group is doled out. That group's high-status individuals are hence rebranded charlatans, and those who have elevated them derided as unthinking sheep. Those willing to throw some prestige to this rabble-rouser, on the other hand, are invited thereby to fancy and advertise themselves enlightened, independent, questioning of a corrupt and ossified establishment, and brave enough to speak truth to illegitimate power. Expect to see more and more of this kind of behavior in smaller and smaller social settings as prestige competition intensifies. 2. Attraction to conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories can be a great salve to one's ego. They tell us, and just as importantly, they tell others, that our low status doesn't reflect our true worth, that our apparent betters haven't really earned their prestige, but have acquired it only as a result of a game unfairly rigged in their favor. Conspiracy mongering is often a central feature of humiliation responses to low status, and the internet has now made it ludicrously easy for those desperate for these sorts of narratives to associate and reinforce their beliefs. Now, I know I probably just pissed a lot of people off, but before you rush to the comments section to angrily defend your conspiracy theory of choice, and let's face it, we've all probably got at least one these days, Let me clarify a few things. I'm not intending to be flatly dismissive here. Real conspiracies have happened and will almost certainly continue to happen. The world is awash in rigged games. I do, however, think it's important we make ourselves aware of the perverse incentives that can make conspiracy theories more appealing than they would be on their evidentiary merits alone. I also don't intend to single out any political or ideological group here. This behavior, like most others on this list, is increasingly common everywhere, left, right, and center. 3. Identitarianism. When we're desperate for status, groups that promise a stable sense of belonging contingent only upon some common feature of identity, rather than valuable talent or action, can start to look really appealing. Identity groups may be nativistic in character, based on shared race, nationality, or culture. They may be class-based, centered on a common set of economic or social circumstances, or they may be interest or ideology-based, centered on a core set of beliefs. There can, of course, be overlap between these group types. What makes all of them attractive to anyone having a hard time making a valued contribution elsewhere is that the price of admission to the eligible is usually very low. Whereas acceptance for our hunter-gatherer ancestors required hard work, useful skills, and demonstrable altruism, acceptance into identity groups often demands little more than the possession of the right background or allegiance to the right perspective. At first, as in our nerdy introvert case, all seems well. New members get a rush of validation and fellow feeling. But as the local dominance effect starts to reorient us within this new focal group, and the upward comparison dominance effect makes it impossible to ignore those members receiving disproportionate shares of attention and acclaim, the warm glow of belonging fades, and all those old status anxieties are gradually reactivated. Whatever the initial appeal of these groups, the pressure to distinguish oneself from one's peers cannot be so easily evaded. 4. Strategic depersonalization. In the context of self-categorization theory, depersonalization involves a conflation of one's personal identity with the identity of one's in-group. When in this perceptual mode, the status differences between oneself and one's groupmates cease to be salient, because one's groupmates are seen, more or less, as extensions of oneself. One may then take pride in their accomplishments and feel shame at their failures, even when one wasn't in any direct causal sense involved in these events. Those status differences that do matter, then, are the differences between one's in-group and one's relevant out-groups. Depersonalization thus affects a reorientation of prestige competition from the within-group level to the between-group level. Now this acts in opposition to the local dominance effect, and thus I suspect we'll only tend to see this strategy when certain conditions are met. Namely, 1. When the number of legitimate upward comparison targets is smaller at the between-group level than the within-group level. And by legitimate here, I mean those targets whose superior status can't be dismissed with a conspiracy theory. 2. When switching to a new group is either unfeasible or unlikely to result in a relative prestige increase. Because group barriers are likely to be most rigid and impermeable in nativistic identity groups, it is among them that we should expect to see this strategy pursued most frequently and intensely. 5. Exemplification. One fairly common way of increasing one's prestige within a local group is to present oneself as an especially committed or normative member of that group. Online, this behavior is most frequently seen, unsurprisingly, in ideology-based identity groups. The aim here, broadly speaking, is to show that one is more devoted to the group's central cause than other group members. The particular forms this strategy takes are now the stuff of internet cliché: virtue signaling, purity testing, and constant calling out of other members or aspirants for failing to satisfactorily uphold group norms. Now, I suspect most of you are thinking of Tumblr or other social justice warrior spaces right about now, but we find this same sort of holier-than-thou signaling in abundance in far-right enclaves as well, where the obsession often centers explicitly on racial purity and paranoia over who might be controlled opposition. This strategy is particularly appealing when there's a lot of between-group conflict, and in such cases it operates in a kind of synergy with depersonalization. After all, one of the easiest and most dramatic ways to prove one's commitment to a group is to identify and attack its enemies, and the riskier the attack, the more compelling the proof. This too becomes a competition, and it's out of this competition that a lot of the most extreme and destructive political attitudes and behaviors currently in our news cycles emerge. This also tends to result in a so-called narcissism of small differences, whereby groups nearest to one's own on the political or ideological landscape are signaled out for particularly intense criticism. Any half-hearted leftist, for example, can object to fascism, but a true progressive, must be willing to call out the liberals, the TERFs, the brocialists, etc. The far right, for their part, reserve for their purple-pilled neighbors slurs like rhino, Republican in name only, cuckservative, and alt-light. 6. Betting on the future. If all current prospects for reducing upward comparison information appear bleak, then one may opt instead to solicit validation from some future community, be it on earth or in heaven. The hope here is that one will be recognized and valued by some group in a better position than any current group, thanks to historical hindsight, to accurately assess one's worth. In many ways, this is just an extreme form of contrarianism, but I want to discuss this particular strategy separately because of the role it plays in an especially destructive pattern of behavior. Now, the thought that one will be vindicated and validated by a wiser future community can be a great comfort to anyone unable to achieve or maintain satisfactory levels of prestige in the present, but it can also be very dangerous. See, one gets no feedback from the future, and so appeals to prestige from these hypothetical communities will tend to err in the direction of really grand gestures. This, when coupled with the resentment anyone pursuing this strategy is apt to feel toward the many current groups in which he has failed to make a splash, can easily turn him toward violent action. Indeed, ideations about future prestige or heavenly reward are common among mass shooters and suicide bombers. The murderous acts these people perpetrate are seldom solely about revenge. Often they are overt performances for which the perpetrators hope to be ultimately revered as martyrs and revolutionaries. It is a stunning testament to the power of the selective pressures that gave us such capacity for shame and humiliation, that we can be driven to sacrifice our very lives for the regard of others, that we can so effortlessly care more about the survival of our reputations than the survival of our own bodies. 7. Isolation. Of course, not everyone plagued by these feelings of valuelessness pursues or persists in a strategy of prestige elicitation. Many simply withdraw from meaningful social engagement altogether. This is a bad place to find oneself in. Remember, signals of social disvalue include not just overt criticism and upward comparison, but being ignored by others, which is to say, receiving no social signals at all. An absence of signals, then, can itself be a negative signal. Though isolation may seem like the only remaining comfort to anyone overburdened by these status anxieties, it is unlikely to make one feel better in the long run. People who isolate themselves in this manner are, almost by definition, harder to notice. Those who can muster humiliation responses and act out in any of the manners described previously tend, unsurprisingly, to receive the most attention, while those more prone to internalizing their shame suffer in comparative silence. Though I have focused on men for the majority of this video, I want to stress at this point that these anxieties and feelings of valuelessness are likely intensifying everywhere. Men may simply be the more visible victims, since the cost they sink into trying to produce continual conspicuous valued action may make it easier for them to regard their lack of prestige as unfair. Women, on the other hand, if Vandello and Boston's model is correct, may tend to receive and thus expect social value based less on their actions than on fairly immutable features of their biology, leaving them with perhaps little recourse but to internalize any perceived signals of disvalue. These expectations are, of course, pretty antiquated in the modern Western economy, but culture is often slow to catch up to social reality. The point is that focusing solely on those who lash out in humiliation against this overabundant upward comparison information may lead us to underestimate the extent, and thus the true cost, of this growing epidemic of shame. The quiet sufferers, whatever their gender, deserve our compassion and concern as well. Now, the most extreme form of social isolation is, of course, suicide, and it is a growing public health concern. The very week Kate Spade and Anthony Bourdain took their lives, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention announced a near 30% increase in U.S. suicide rate from 1999 to 2016. The CDC's announcement, like most news events today, proved a Rorschach test of the public's political hobby horses and tribalized personal grievances. But amid all the boilerplate hand-wringing, scapegoating, and victim-blaming, one could find nuggets of genuine insight. One of the more illuminating takes I happened across came from a colleague of mine in a post explaining some of her own past struggles with suicidal ideation. I'd like to share now a few of her words. Quote, "Suicide almost always comes into my head after I have gone through all the ways I could isolate myself to fight this illness without collateral damage, so I'm not a burden on the people I love. It usually starts with wanting to free my partner from the stress and frustration my anxious behavior causes him on a daily basis, so I turn to budgeting first. But the numbers always tell me that I can't get my own place without increasing the financial burden on loved ones who I know would happily take on any burden to keep me around. So I tend to be left reasoning that the only way to relieve my loved ones of the burden of dealing with me and my anxiety is suicide. Those moments are horrible. In those moments, no amount of "you are loved" helps, because I know I am loved. In those moments, I know who I could reach out to, but in those moments, it doesn't feel like getting help to reach out. To reach out in my moments of extreme overwhelm is to shift the burden. If I reach out, I knowingly inflict stress and frustration on someone I love. That's how my anxious brain gets to suicidal thoughts. So how am I usually brought back? What has worked? Feeling like I am valued, that no amount of frustration and stress my anxious brain could cause outweighs what I give those I love. I know, when I'm thinking clearly, that value precedes love in most relationships, and that to tell someone they are loved is often to tell them by implication that they are valued. But mental illness twists things around. The value has to be genuine and specific, or my anxious brain will convince me that you value me only because you love me. Unquote. There are two related topics in this quote that I think deserve particular attention. The first is this feeling of being a burden to others. This is a very common preoccupation among those who attempt or fantasize about suicide. According to the interpersonal psychological theory of suicidal behavior, developed by psychologist Thomas Joyner, suicidal desire is jointly caused by two persistent cognitive states. One, thwarted belongingness, that is a feeling of being alienated from others. And two, perceived burdensomeness. Not how much of a burden to others one actually is, mind, but how much of a burden one believes oneself to be. This latter construct, according to a recent meta-analysis, is particularly strongly predictive of suicidal ideation. This makes sense when we remind ourselves of the ancestral context for prestige-monitoring cognitive machinery. When we all lived in small groups and received a share of every hunter's kill, we really were imposing a constant default burden on others. The continual production of value to our community is how we use to offset this burden and thus earn our keep. This is why most of us are incapable of resting on our accomplishments for very long. Why even when we've done well for ourselves and others, our status anxieties always seem to catch up to us. It's why our appetite for purpose is practically unquenchable. And it's why even beloved celebrities often fail to escape these feelings of burdensomeness. This brings me to the second topic I want to pull out of that quote, the perceived insufficiency of love. One remarkable fact about human psychology is that we tend to respond negatively to inequitable outcomes, not just when those outcomes benefit others at our expense, this is true even of lower primates, but even when they benefit us at the expense of others. One could be forgiven for thinking that unconditional love and acceptance is exactly what someone suffering from internalized shame and low self-esteem needs, but this may be a dangerous mistake. Unconditional love can be a very scary thing to one who either feels like a burden already or fears becoming one, because it places control of the relationship entirely in the hands of the provider of that love. What can be given without need of justification can be taken away without need of justification. Unconditional love simply isn't trustworthy. If I'm in a partnership in which I feel I'm contributing a lot and the other party suddenly defects on me, then I have a legitimate grievance, a case I can make for myself. My sunk costs give me at least a prima facie defensible recourse to a humiliation response. I can rally others to me to shame and shun the defector, and I may be able to parlay their sympathies into new opportunities for supportive cooperation, my anger being itself a kind of proof of my willingness to invest substantively in such ventures. These options aren't open to me in a relationship in which I am solely a beneficiary. The other party could abandon me at any moment, for any reason, and, providing I'm an adult capable of caring for myself, would have every right to do so. Children, perhaps, need unconditional love, but adults need to believe they've earned whatever care and esteem come their way. They need to feel worthy of love. This throws another interesting light, I think, on the phenomenon of religion, or at least its monotheistic species. After all, a monotheistic God is in many ways the ideal cooperation partner. His love is not usually free, but you get at least the promise of exactly what you pay for. No strings, no hidden fees, no fine print, no mandatory arbitration agreement. The conditions of his love are clear and presumed consistent over time and context. Believe X, perform ritual Y, follow commandment Z, spread the word. Paradoxical as it may sound when speaking of an arrangement between a brainy ape and a deity, this consistency places all sense of control over the relationship in the hands of the believer. A capital G God lacks deception, caprice, bad moods. He won't cheat, won't desert you in opportunistic selfishness, won't suddenly raise the price of admission to his kingdom. He will love you precisely to the extent that you provably love him. And should you keep this covenant, you need never worry that you might become an undue burden, for there is no cost an omnipotent being cannot effortlessly pay. A mono-God is the literal apotheosis of all our community obligations and expectations, a magic ledger whereon anyone can read his or her ideal balance of personal credits and debits. Let's summarize and take stock. We evolved this constellation of social emotions and cognitive faculties for seeking and monitoring relative prestige in order to ensure we stayed in the good graces of our group mates and didn't end up having to rough it on the African savannah alone. In these ancient, largely egalitarian groups, upward comparisons would have been reliable signals that our membership was in jeopardy, and the shame or humiliation we felt in response to such signals would have motivated us to either repair our image in the group, whether by reducing our net cost or by highlighting our underappreciated contributions, or to find a new group more congenial to us. Today, social exclusion doesn't pose nearly the existential threat it once did, but all this old cognitive machinery is still in us, still pushing us to doggedly follow the envy minimization principle, and our modern virtual environments are feeding this machinery near a constant stream of upward comparison information. Little wonder we're all so miserable and vicious toward each other. What can we do about this? I'll save any deep solution brainstorming for another video. Suffice it to say, I'm still thinking all this over. In the meantime, I think it's worth reminding ourselves that these status anxieties are the result of a twofold error. For one thing, our shame system tends to track the absolute number of upward comparison targets rather than their share of the overall group. This worked well enough in small hunter-gatherer bands of fixed size, but in the larger social groups of our vastly interconnected modern world, this tendency can lead us to grossly underestimate our relative status. The second error, as I've already suggested, concerns the ecological appropriateness of our status-related emotions. In our ancestral past, maintaining a certain level of prestige was materially critical to survival, but this is often no longer the case. One could now, in principle, live a perfectly healthy life as a loner, if only we could get our brains to stop tormenting us. Now I know these systems are pretty cognitively impenetrable, but if we can keep these errors in mind and maintain this broader, deflationary perspective on prestige competition, we may at least be able to prevent our thoughts from doubling down on, and thus further entrenching, our anxious emotions. To close, I'd like to issue a general call across the political and ideological spectrum to start taking this matter seriously, and to join me in workshopping potential solutions. Now, I know it's hard to get pumped up to fight one's own psychology, or to fight a set of impersonal circumstances. We want our scapegoats, our exculpatory conspiracies, our hostile divisions, our barbarian hordes. These things are, after all, devices for shoring up prestige, but they're not what we need right now. In the end, they only feed and intensify the very status anxieties that provoke them. It is these anxieties that we must make our common enemy. They are eroding public trust everywhere, poisoning political discourse and debate, and making us increasingly alien and incomprehensible to each other. They are the principal reason we're so lonely, bitter, and desperate for recognition. Whatever your particular socio-political hobby horses, I suspect you have a legitimate stake in addressing the issues I've been discussing in this video. Worried about the proliferation of zero-sum identity politics? Recall why it is that identity groups are so appealing to us. Frustrated with the state of the dating landscape? I guarantee you these anxieties are exerting a toxic influence on mate choice and artificially intensifying the sting of rejection. Concerned about the growing desire for safe spaces, whether on university campuses or in the goals of ethno-nationalists? What conditions, social and psychological, do you suppose might make people so desperate to preemptively exclude potential status rivals? We'd all benefit, at the end of the day, from dialing down these anxieties. No, doing so won't magically dissolve all our political disputes, but it will dissolve a lot of the perverse incentives that are currently making our politics so volatile. I'd love to know any thoughts you might have toward possible solutions to this radical environmental mismatch we now find ourselves in. So comment away, but please be respectful of others. And if you found this video a worthwhile contribution, and don't mind giving me a small, assuredly temporary prestige boost, go ahead and do that whole like, share, and subscribe thing. I hope to bring you more food for thought of equal or greater nutritional value in the future. Until then, stay shameless.